3.5 years ago, when The Last of Us Part 2 was first announced, I was immediately worried. The original game held a special place in my heart as being a tremendous moment in AAA game storytelling, and most importantly, the original game felt like a complete thought in ways that big budget game stories rarely ever do. I've always felt that a sequel to The Last of Us was going to be exceptionally difficult to pull off. How can Naughty Dog follow up on such a self-contained tale that ends with phenomenal ambiguity? Wouldn't going back to these characters inherently reduce the strengths of the original? Would a sequel be able to justify its own existence and tell a story that genuinely felt worth telling? It's an incredibly hard act to follow, and even though I was worried about a sequel to The Last of Us, I also had faith in Naughty Dog to go back to the well without spoiling it. As time went on and we started to see more of the game, I felt a growing sense of unease about where things were headed. There was an off-putting obsession with violence in the way the game was shown off over the years, and no real indication as to what the story was going to be. About 6 months ago, I went dark on The Last of Us Part 2, wanting to be spoiled on as little as possible so I could approach the game with an open mind. And I did. I managed to miss all of the spoilers that unfortunately leaked out months ago, and went into the long-awaited sequel genuinely fascinated to see how I'd feel about it when it was over. I knew nothing about the story, structure, or even gameplay changes going in on day one. And now here I am, having played it all and spent an extra couple of days thinking about it, and it saddens me greatly to say that I do not think The Last of Us 2 is a success, primarily due to the story it tells, but also in its gameplay and structure. Story discussion will wait until the last portion of the video, where it'll be discussed at length and in full spoilery detail. Don't worry, there will be warnings beforehand. I went into The Last of Us Part 2 with high expectations, not just for the story, but for gameplay and structure too. Uncharted 4 and Lost Legacy, while still awfully familiar, improved the combat experience substantially from 2 and 3, dramatically expanded their level design, and told great human stories. I was expecting a similar jump in quality from the original Last of Us to Part 2, as I had experienced from Uncharted 3 to Uncharted 4. And in some ways, I did get that leap, but in far, far too many ways, I simply did not. With The Last of Us Part 2, the gameplay systems have simultaneously evolved and stayed exactly as they were 7 years ago. There are a solid number of improvements to the main meat of the gameplay loop, which is human-based combat encounters. Stealth systems have been dramatically ramped up, and you now have to be cognizant of enemy lines of sight, sound, and even smell when dogs are around. And you have far more flexibility in managing those systems. Grass can be hidden in, levels are substantially larger and more interconnected, and your arsenal is expanded with some especially useful new gear, including the ability to craft a silencer for one of your pistols. For whatever reason though, it took me nearly 10 hours of playing to acclimate to the aiming and the controls of the game, during which most of the encounters I had with enemies were downright frustrating. They were scrappy fights in a way that didn't feel fun. I felt like a bumbling idiot messing up the controls, fumbling stealth, and missing every shot in fights. I'm not exactly sure why I struggled for so long. I'm definitely not the best at using a controller for shooting now after so many years on PC, but there was something about the control scheme that just regularly caught me up for longer than anticipated. Anyways, once I had finally gotten good at playing the game, I started to enjoy the human encounters a fair bit. For a good 3 to 5 hours, each human encounter was a good time. All the new systems allowed for a more immersive experience for a while, with those encounters being tense yet satisfying in the way a good stealth game should be. Kiting enemies around, going in and out of states of enemy alertness, silently picking off everyone in your way, and then slipping off was an enjoyable loop. But after a few hours of enjoying the human combat encounters, I started to have new problems. You see, The Last of Us 2 is a game that focuses heavily on realism and immersion. From visuals and sound to animation and stealth, the game is trying to make things feel as real as possible. And that's where the human encounters started to fall apart for me. Tiny things that would shatter that veneer of realism. I think once I figured out how to play the game, I wanted to start approaching things the way I would with something like Metal Gear Solid 5. I'd try small different things like saving a human enemy from being gutted with the hopes of interacting with him, only for him to switch to a dead state the second I entered combat. Or how I couldn't shoot a chain holding an enemy back, but instead had to walk up and hit triangle on it. Or how enemies that are tall and fat don't die when I shoot them in the head with a gun, but instead take 2 or 3 rounds, and there's no real explanation for that aside from them being tall and a little fat. Or how you have super limited ammo except for when a big set piece happens where you suddenly have unlimited ammo. Or how you could look down into an area and there would be no enemies there, but as soon as you dropped into that area, enemies would spawn in. I know, it's all really small stuff. But for whatever reason, for me, when a game presents itself as being super realistic, I then try to approach it in ways I'd approach these things if it was actually real. And when basic things that would work in real life don't work, it all starts to fall apart for me. That veneer of realism was also constantly broken for me whenever there were allies around. I tried every difficulty option for allies and none of them worked well. Simply put, companions in this game are completely useless. In stealth, they do nothing except occasionally stand up and sprint around right in front of enemies and remain unnoticed. In combat, they might sometimes shoot their gun, and if they do, it takes them numerous shots to take down a single enemy. The friendly AI seemed useless throughout my entire playthrough in a way that I never even thought about with the first game, though it has been a while since that first game. I think it's also easy to forget about Ellie in the original game because she's still a child and you don't expect her to be amazingly useful in combat. But in part 2, you are never with theoretically useless companions. Every ally you ever go into combat with is a stone cold killer, or at least in theory. But in practice, they are more than a bumbling idiot than I am. Allies also constantly got in my way in a way that I haven't had with a Sony game. I don't remember it being a problem in the original, and it was never a problem in something like God of War, but in part 2, every time I turned around or needed to move quickly, it felt like I found myself stuck up against a friendly, and it drives me absolutely crazy. In addition to the game trying for extreme realism and not quite committing enough to it, I also eventually started to find the stealth systems to be nowhere near as deep or compelling as I thought. Again, I know it's unfair to think about something like MGS5 constantly, but the bar was raised by that and other immersive sim-style games this generation, and it has changed the way my brain approaches realistically presented gameplay systems. And in the case of stealth in The Last of Us 2, it became harder for me to maintain. I think most of that came from me starting to move too quickly through the stealth, which was happening because I was getting bored by the 15-hour mark. As I said earlier, there's a decent amount of new stuff here, with the silencer being the best new addition. But I think after about 15 hours or even earlier, there just isn't enough new tools to play with. You have a bow, again, which is still good. You can speed up the very long stealth kill animation, of which there is really only one per enemy. You can suppress one of your pistols, craft stun bombs and explosive mousetraps, but by 15 hours you've gotten all those tools and used those tools extensively, and then there's not really anything new added to the game. Yes, there's a switch up in those tools after the midpoint of the game, but those tools are basically just reskinned versions of the ones you've been using prior. So at around the 15-hour mark, I was just rushing because I was bored of the stealth loop. And once you start rushing, you realize that combat encounters are incredibly easy on normal difficulty because you can just hide behind a piece of cover and headshot the enemies and be done with it. Now, this all mainly applies to human combat. There are also, of course, the infected. This is the area of combat and stealth that has seen the least innovation. Granted, it has been a while since I played the original game, but to me, it feels like dealing with the infected has not been expanded upon at all. You have bottles and bricks to distract enemies. You can shoot them all, of course, or you can slowly walk around and hit triangle on all of them and do the exact same overly long stealth kill animation on every single one of them. I remember being immediately worried and then bored by the infected encounters after only 2 hours of play in the game. It's surprising to me that there has been so little expansion to this whole area of combat. There are also 2 or 3 combat encounters where you have infected and humans all in the same play space, and those are easily my favorite combat encounters in the game, just like they were my favorite combat encounters in the Left Behind DLC when they were first introduced. It's just a shame that in a 20+ hour long game with dozens and dozens of combat encounters, there are only really 3 where you get to have the fun of infected and humans and you all fighting each other. The AI across the board in part 2 never felt as smart as I'd like, but in these encounters it was great fun to sit back and watch the AI and watch them react surprisingly well. There were usually 1 or 2 humans that would fire shots off and get killed by clickers, and then others would be extremely stealthy and seemed like they were working hard not to get killed. I love loved all 3 of these encounters and would have loved to see way more throughout, but instead they feel like an afterthought. There's also a real lack of enemy variety or new enemies throughout. Granted, in the case of humans, there's not a lot to work with in a realistic way. The only different type of human enemy is the very cliched big boys or big girls that have more health because they're big? I don't really know. On the infected side, I believe that there are 2 new enemies, but it says a lot to me that I could have sworn that these 2 enemies were in the original game. It's been only 2 years since I replayed The Last of Us, and I think I have a decent memory, but I guess not. Part 2 does indeed have 2 enemies, and they don't really add much to the experience of infected encounters. Actually, now, just researching this as I write it, it turns out there is only 1 new enemy. One of the enemies that I thought was new, and the only one that I thought was interesting, are the Stalker enemies, but it turns out they were actually introduced in the Left Behind DLC, so yeah, I guess it's only 1 new enemy? After 7 years? 1 new enemy. I'm disappointed that there aren't a bunch of fun new enemies. It's only been 4 years in the world since the last game took place, but 4 years is a while, and I was hoping that in those 4 years some new infected types would have popped up. But the only new enemy is a very bloater-like and releases acidic gas, and it never really offered anything at all to the encounters. This lack of innovation with the infected was surprising to me. I expected more from Naughty Dog. And this lack of innovation is something I felt about quite a few major aspects of the design of The Last of Us Part 2. Now, I completely understand that Part 2 is a sequel, and like all sequels, it has to do things similarly to the first game. But that first game is now 7 years old, and gaming has come a long way, with even Naughty Dog themselves seemingly retiring some of their old design tropes. But that has all seemingly been ignored or forgotten with The Last of Us 2. It is full of old, uninspired game design that I am just downright tired of now. The worst of which is the dull and tired environmental traversal puzzle. You couldn't see it there, but I put up sneer quotes for that when I said puzzle because I really don't think they're puzzles. Rather just the exact same basic find the thing to get to here to progress that Naughty Dog has been leaning on for over a decade now. Naughty Dog leans on things like ladders and boxes so much that early in Uncharted Lost Legacy, the game makes a point of committing to no more boxes, and it stayed true to that, and it was better for it. I was tired of moving dumpsters around when I played the original Last of Us 7 years ago. I was extremely tired of it in Uncharted 4, and now in Part 2, it feels almost like a joke with how frequent these so-called puzzles pop up. It goes on though. The frequency with which you squeeze through a door and then get surprise attacked by an enemy is something you could set your watch by or turn into a very dangerous drinking game. Safes are also all over the world, and codes are cornerly scrawled on walls or in notes nearby. There's a drawn out and awful sequence where you're getting constantly shot at by a sniper with perfect aim and unlimited ammo. Wall graffiti is everywhere, and at times it's so ridiculous and on the nose that it actually feels like parody. Collectible notes all read more or less the same and are just variations of, "Oh, I had to do it, please forgive me," or "Oh my god, he went crazy," and they just offer nothing worthwhile. And the pacing of the game, that back and forth between traversal, exploration, combat, and cutscenes, happens like clockwork. Granted, that pacing is still effective. It's an incredibly easy game to play in long chunks. I just feel like this might have been the game that broke me on the Naughty Dog formula and structure. It feels fundamentally old. The Last of Us Part 2, despite all the sheen and improvements to stealth, feels like exactly the same game as I remember the original feeling 7 years ago. I was hoping to see major innovation in the basic structure and game design for a sequel this big and this long awaited and this late in the generation. Yes, you get a very large, very open, and very refreshing area very early on in the game that feels more like what I was hoping for. It was building off of Uncharted 4 and especially Lost Legacy. But that area is the only single area like that in the entire game. After that pleasant, wide open space, the game goes back to being almost painfully linear. And again, I think Naughty Dog is still incredibly good at their own formula, and that formula can still be somewhat effective, but throughout the game I was consistently surprised at how dated it felt and how bored it left me. This generation has seen a lot of fascinating mix-ups from major developers, the best of which are when a developer does something unexpected, and the original Last of Us was a major mix-up at the time for Naughty Dog. They turned their own formula on its head in fantastic ways in 2013, and simply haven't this time around. Now, if there's one area where Naughty Dog has always excelled beyond reproach, it's in presentation, and Part 2 is no exception. In fact, The Last of Us Part 2 was easily one of the best presented games of the entire generation. Visually, it is splendid, though I do think the game could have used a bit more visual variety. Everything is more or less green and gray and wet, and hey, look, I get it. That's Seattle in a nutshell. But it does get a bit stale at times. That said, it's remarkable to see what the PS4 is still capable of. While graphically it's great, animation is where the game really stands out. There is such tremendous attention to detail in the animation. Cutscenes are obviously on a whole other level, and I'll come back to them in a moment, but gameplay animations are also exceptional. Faces and hands are what the game is best at rendering, which are traditionally the two hardest things to emulate, but Part 2 nails it. The way faces scrunch up and exert in combat, especially stealth kills, never ceases to amaze. The fine detail with which Ellie drops the hammer back on her pistol is amazing. It's just an endless deluge of remarkable animation in gameplay and especially in cutscenes. Naughty Dog has been doing incredible work with real-time cutscenes this generation, and The Last of Us 2 feels like as impressive of a jump in that regard as Uncharted 4 felt from Uncharted 3. At no point during a cutscene did I ever think about the fact that these were video game cutscenes. Okay, well, maybe once or twice I did, but it was because I was thinking about how insane they looked for being real-time cutscenes on a PS4. What I mean though is that character-wise, I never was taken out of the cutscenes. Performances from all the actors are consistently excellent, and every character, big and small, is fully committed to the work. Those performances are then brought to life with the most believable faces we've seen in game cutscenes so far. Sony's first-party eye technology, whatever it is, has always been world-class, but Part 2 really steps it up. There is so much emotion to the eyes here, and this will sound weird, but the eyes are wet in such believable ways. When a character is fighting back tears, the moisture and redness is exactly what you'd expect a real human eye to look like. The hands shake and tremble or pluck guitar strings exactly the way real hands do. It's just stunning stuff. Even though I may not like the content of a lot of the cutscenes, including an excessive amount of grotesque violence, all of it is rendered with so much care and attention and fidelity. And it's all backed up by incredible sound design. Clickers stand out especially, their clicks have never been more bone-rattling. Gunshots are still loud as hell and I love it, though I do wish that footsteps from human enemies were audible at all. Anyways. As I said, the voice work is all top tier, and I especially like the in-combat music. It's got a droning, sinister, Sicario-inspired sound that works really well here. The famous, somber, banjo-led music takes a back seat though, and is used very sparingly throughout, and it's not used nearly as effectively in the storytelling. The first game punctuated its moments with music in a way that 2 doesn't do nearly as well. Unfortunately, all of this incredible best-in-the-business presentation does not make up for a bad story, and The Last of Us Part 2 falls apart for me with its story. It's a simplistic, miserable tale about revenge and how bad revenge is. It tries too hard to make you care or feel sympathetic for characters that are practically inhuman, and it has a comically narrow view of humanity. I can't really say a lot more, or say it well without going fully into spoilers, so here comes the spoiler section. You can clearly see where to skip to if you don't want spoilers. These will cover any and all aspects of the story from beginning to end, so you have been warned. As I said at the start of this review, I have always found the fundamental idea of a sequel to The Last of Us to be a flawed one. That primarily stems from the character arcs that Ellie and Joel go on feeling fully concluded by the end of that game. A sequel also felt like a flawed idea because of the still remarkable ending of the original. The acceptance of a horrible lie by Ellie and Joel and the ambiguity of whether those characters believe that lie was powerful. It's an ending that still to this day sparks good discussions. The great power of an ambiguous ending is that it makes the story more personal to those experiencing it. The Last of Us was a game primarily about characters and less so about plot. You played as those characters, watched them do things both in and out of your control, got a very thorough understanding of those characters, and then were left to write the rest of their story in your mind. The ambiguous ending allows for you to decide their fates, and that adds to the lasting impact of the story because the story becomes partially yours. Again though, I was open to seeing what a sequel would do. I can assure you I went into this story with an open and unspoiled mind, but from very early on I began to have problems with the story. The inciting incident of the entire story is the murder of Joel in front of Ellie. It's a great scene, it's tastefully shot, the performances from everyone are exceptional, and it left a genuine impact. I, in fact, don't even want to watch the scene again because it was so effective. It was traumatizing in all the right ways. But I immediately began to worry that this story was indeed just going to be a long revenge plot, and Joel being the catalyst for kicking off that revenge plot is inherently flawed to me. You see, I completely and absolutely agree with the death of Joel. Joel is not a good person. An early line from the original game that has always stood out to me is Tess saying, "We're shitty people, Joel." And he especially is, even if he doesn't know it. The original game always felt like a bit of an indictment of Joel and the type of video game protagonist he represents. Yes, Joel is sympathetic and has depth to him, and he is not solely nasty, but he does unspeakably cruel and terrible things and does them outside of your control. He is his own person in the original, and the ending has him commit an act of shocking selfishness. It's understandable, yes, but it is also reprehensible. So Joel's murder being the catalyst for revenge makes perfect sense for Ellie, but it doesn't make a compelling catalyst for me. He had it coming, and quite frankly, he kind of deserved it. So his death sets off this tale of revenge. While I was concerned initially, I maintained hope that the story would twist and turn and go into interesting, clever directions. What I feared most was that the game would be about how ruinous revenge is. I feared this because I know that revenge is ruinous. I have consumed countless pieces of entertainment that depict this, and as a moral human being, I know it to be wrong and pointless. And the last thing I need is another story telling me that forgiveness is the answer, not revenge. As it turns out, The Last of Us Part 2 is indeed an overly long, uninspired, and comically on-the-nose tale about the ruination caused by revenge, and learning that the people Ellie wants killed are, in fact, people. If at this point you didn't know somehow, the game is split into two parts. The first half you play as Ellie, and the second half you play as Abby, the woman who killed Joel in the opening. Now, I have no problem with playing as someone other than Ellie, but the switch to playing as Abby is so on the nose that it mostly invalidates the entire second half of the game for me. The entire second half is supposed to make me feel sympathetic to Abby and her friends. It doesn't. It doesn't because of how blatant the attempts at sympathy are. There is nothing subtle or clever about the perspective switch, and thus nothing successful about it either. A little anecdote. Before release, Joe and I saw a tweet about how you killed a dog in the game and then saw a flashback of playing fetch with said dog, so that you would then be sad. We both laughed because we both presumed it was an obvious joke. There was no way something so obvious and cheesy could be in this game. I had forgotten about that tweet when I got into the game. I had written it off as a funny joke. It had to be a funny joke, right? As it turns out, no, it was not a joke. Near the end of Ellie's portion of the game, dogs are added to the mix and you kill a lot of them. And one of the last things you do as Ellie is kill a dog that rushes you when you get to Abby's hideout. One of the first things you do when you flash back to playing as Abby is see the dogs with their owners, and you do indeed play fetch with those dogs. In fact, you are forced to play fetch with the dog that Ellie will kill later on. That is how on the nose The Last of Us Part 2 is. A tweet I thought was a funny joke because of how dumb it was turned out to be literally true and is, quite honestly, a perfect summary of the Ellie-Abby switcheroo. Ellie's portion of the game is full of miserable, awful people. Ellie especially so. Then you switch to Abby, and the miserable, awful people continue. Now, Abby is not quite as awful as Ellie, but she is still awful. In fact, just about every single character in the game is utterly vile, selfish, cruel, and one-dimensional. The only two characters that are even remotely likable for me were Yara and Lev, but they don't have a ton of character and serve mainly as obvious devices to make me try and feel sympathy towards Abby. Lev exists to try and force an ounce of humanity onto Abby, and it works solely because every other character in the game is so abhorrent. That's one of the major problems with The Last of Us Part 2. It's that every character and faction is awful, and they get to continue on being awful with really no worthwhile repercussions to their morals. Yes, Ellie is left alone by the end, but she doesn't seem to have any regrets whatsoever for all the terror she's inflicted upon the world. Yes, Abby is also a shell of her former self by the end, but she gets to sail away to live happily ever after, despite the terrors she's inflicted upon the world. Sure, their lives have been upended by their lust for revenge, but they, as people, do not seem to show any self-reflection or self-awareness of just how terrible they really are. We never really learn anything worthwhile about any of these characters as emotional human beings because they are so hollow and simplistic. Playing as Abby and meeting her friends doesn't make me like her and her friends. Her friends are not deep or original characters. Manny's character is that he sleeps around a lot and likes anime? Mel is a sad doctor stuck in a messy love triangle. Owen is stuck in a midlife crisis and a regretful former lover of Abby. And that's all there is to them. That's all we learn about them. And on Ellie's side, we learn nothing new about Ellie except that she's turned into a completely cruel and miserable human being that thinks only about herself. Dina doesn't have much to offer besides being the occasionally witty and generally good-spirited foil to Ellie's one-note miserableness. Yara and Lev are compelling and likable, but Yara is mostly just the girl who got her arm smashed with a hammer and helped save Abby. Lev is probably the most thought out new character, but even he only has really one trait, which is that he's transgender and being mistreated by the world, including his mother. As soon as he and Yara have both served their purpose of making Abby seem even remotely like a human being, they both just stop being characters in the story. No one really goes on an emotional journey, let alone one that is worthwhile or original. The journeys of the two main heroes, or villains, whichever you want to call the two women, is that they learn that revenge is ruinous and that maybe forgiveness is the answer. Even the game's shallow attempts at themes of forgiveness are lost because of how vapid and vile the characters are. None of the factions are anything more than cliched apocalyptic factions, too. The Scars are seemingly all just religious zealots who love hanging people and then gutting them. Yara and Lev are really the only two that don't seem to be completely insane. You never learn anything about the Scars beyond that they are cruel and miserable. The Wolves are militarized badasses who want to kill all the Scars for reasons we never learn. You never learn anything about the Wolves beyond that they are all also cruel and miserable. And at the end of the game, you encounter a third faction that has a forced labor camp, and that's it. You never learn anything about them beyond that they are also cruel and miserable. Now look, people can be cruel and they can be miserable. I get that. It's a simple and tragic fact of humanity, and we've seen it proven a lot recently. But The Last of Us 2 has a pathetically narrow-minded and grim view of humanity, so much so that I would say Part 2 has no humanity in it. The only time I felt like I was looking at human beings in this game is in a flashback sequence to Joel and Ellie, set not long after the first game, where the two are exploring a museum together. It's a long, beautifully done sequence that serves as a tremendous reminder of how well thought out those two characters were in the original game, and it serves as a stark contrast to how one-dimensional all the characters are in 2. I simply have no time anymore in my heart or my mind for media that regards humanity as being so one-note because I fundamentally believe it to be woefully inaccurate. Yes, people can and do a lot of terrible shit, but on a broad scale, people are extraordinarily complex. The Last of Us Part 2 does not believe that. It believes we are all simply vile, except perhaps Joel. Something about the way Joel is revered in the game, by the game, seems incredibly wrong to me. Right at the moment when Ellie is about to finally kill Abby, Ellie sees a flashback of Joel smiling at her while he's plucking at a guitar, and she stops, letting Abby go. Ellie has PTSD flashbacks to Joel's death, but not to any of the other horrible, disgusting things she herself did to other human beings. Joel is spoken of by everyone in the game in almost heroic terms, and in the final moment of the game, we see Ellie telling Joel that she would like to try and forgive him for what he did with the Fireflies. It really does feel like the game itself loves and reveres Joel, and I deeply disagree with that. Joel is a bad person. We know that from the first game. He's complex, he's sympathetic, and he's a well-realized human character, but he always felt like a bit of a villain to me, like an example of how not to be a person, and certainly not someone to be looked up to. But it feels like Naughty Dog has forgotten any of those hints they put in the first game. That they themselves have fallen in love with Joel the way that fans fell in love with him foolishly back then. Anyways, I'm rambling on now. There's so much wrong with this story, so much that I dislike about it, so much that I think is self-indulgent and borderline amateurish that I could go on for another 20 minutes. I wish I had the mental energy to talk about how grotesque and unnecessary all of the violence is in the game, how it all is just there and serves no purpose and isn't reflected upon or criticized in any capacity. It's shocking and stomach-churning and presented through a lens that honestly feels masturbatory by the end. It just all amounts to nothing. I also wish I had the mental energy to cover how disappointing it was that Lev's ending arc was that he accidentally killed his mother because she disapproved of him so much that she tried to kill him. How that was such an opportunity to show a small, tiny ounce of humanity in this sea of dark miserableness, but instead the game decided to use it as yet another opportunity to show how utterly vile humanity is. I wish I had the mental energy to explain why I laughed out loud numerous times when the game was trying to be serious. I laughed out loud when Ellie murdered a pregnant woman because it was so on the nose and corny. I laughed out loud when Abby and Owen had their angry sex scene because it was so on the nose and corny. Nothing to me says, please take our art seriously, like an angry sex scene. It was so hollow. And I wish I had the mental energy to list all the times I rolled my eyes at the game or explain the shock I felt when the game ended, and all I could think was, that's it? The Last of Us Part 2 has no real plot, and it has no real characters. The people in the game go places, things happen, and they murder each other violently and hatefully. The thinnest and most basic ounce of humanity is forced onto them, but they experience no real changes in worldview, and when it's all said and done, it doesn't seem like the lead characters have changed at all or learned anything worthwhile about themselves, each other, or the world around them. They all seem as hateful as they did at the start. The story of The Last of Us Part 2 is a profound disappointment. I adored the original story. I remember playing it through a second time with my sister by my side, and she adored it too, despite not playing games or really paying any attention to them. I loved that it was a game that broke through to people who don't play games and proved to them that gaming can indeed be smart and nuanced and tell stories through characters. That it can depict human beings for what they are, which is complicated. Part 2 is an unfortunate reminder that gaming still has a long way to go with storytelling. It's an unfortunate reminder that incredible presentation does not make up for bad story and paper-thin, reprehensible characters. Every time I sat down to play The Last of Us Part 2, from my first session to my last, I went in wanting to like it, hoping to have a good time with it. Every time I stopped playing it, I left shaking my head at how much I was disliking it and at how poor the story was. Right up to the credits, I was hoping the game would finally find a way to justify its own existence, that it might finally turn the story in a different direction and reveal something worthwhile about people or the world, but it never did. Great stories should do just that. They should let me learn things about people and the world that I didn't know before. Part 2 never offers that. It says the world is full of vile, miserable, selfish people, and that to seek revenge is to seek ruination, and that's it. Though parts of the game feel like they may have fallen back in time from next generation, large swaths feel like they fell right out of last gen, and no amount of polish, art, or animation can make up for those failings. At the end of it all, The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that I feel didn't need to be made. It feels like a game that actively lessens the original's best moments, and worst of all, it's a game I wish I hadn't played.